since the state of Israel, which was only a few years old at that time, began to consider the issue of reparations from Germany for the Shoah, for the Holocaust. It had been proposed in 1949 by Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, but West Germany did not respond until a few years later, in March 1951. And so then in Israel, during that whole year, there were intense deliberations that were held, whether to accept or not these reparations. So the critics were outraged, and they believed it would whitewash Germany's sins during the war. And debate raged on through the spring, through the summer. And Menachem Begin, who was then the leader of a small party, became the voice of the opposition. And he made an impassioned speech before Israel's parliament, the Knesset, questioning whether the new German government was any different than the old German government, saying where are all of its current leaders been during the war? And he argued, how can you put a value on the 6 million lives that were lost in the Shoah? And would the new Germans not rearm and become as the old Germans were? On the other hand, on the other side was Israel's prime minister, Ben-Gurion, and his coalition believed that the promised German aid would be an important catalyst for Israel's economy at a time when it was just beginning to grow and experiencing hardship. And Ben-Gurion understood that the German motivation was about restoring Germany into among the family of nations, impossible as long as the issue of what had happened during the war was unresolved. And then when it came to the West German parliament in 1951, the Chancellor Konrad Adenauer said at the time, unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity. The federal government are prepared jointly with representatives of Jewry and the State of Israel to bring about a solution of the material indemnity problem, thus easing the way to the spiritual settlement of infinite suffering. Powerful words. And addressing an idea, really a painful idea, of giving pardon in return for money for the horrors of the Shoah. But in essence, all three parties, the German government and both sides of the debate in Israel, were declaring the truth of a very powerful idea that underlines all of our Torah portion that we read this morning, that without justice, if you don't have justice, there can be no spiritual well-being in a society or in any relationship between individuals or nations. So the beginning of the Torah portion opened with the words, you shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. You shall not judge unfairly, you shall show no partiality, you shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. Justice, justice shall you pursue. Right? When there is no fairness, when there is no equality, where there are bribes, where the just plea is not heard, there can be no peace. Justice, justice you shall pursue. And so the Germans, they understood that they could not find their dignity among the nations or find spiritual renewal, even just as important, if not more important than the industrial renewal that they were already achieving and succeeding in those early years, without this act of justice. And Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, he was willing to walk down that road of giving reparations for what had happened during the Holocaust, because he considered to be an appropriate and fitting measure of justice that the German nation responsible for trying to destroy Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, and causing such horrific suffering, would help build the Jewish state. And Begin, on the other hand, he believed there could be no justice ever for the crimes of the Germans, payments for Jewish suffering, as he declared in that speech. And he warned repeatedly about the rise again of the Nazis. And so our tradition and commentators, thinking about this question of justice leading to peace and well-being for all of us, keep asking the question, what is this justice? What is this due justice? And how do you find this justice? How do you create it in a place where it no longer is? How do we find justice that leads to well-being? And so Rashi, a French commentator from medieval times, declares, "Justice, justice you shall pursue, that true justice depends on having honest and reliable courts." Simple as that, but not as simple as it sounds. In the end, and he adds, because issues that are complex moral and ethical issues can't only depend on going back to existing laws, consulting them, but you need to have the wisdom of the judges. Not only has there to be wisdom of the judges, but the people have to trust in that wisdom. Justice, justice you shall pursue, and the verse concludes that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. And so he says that the appointment of honest judges, magistrates, officials, and leaders is sufficient to keep Israel in life and to settle in security in their land. At historic moments, for all of us, the quality of our leaders and magistrates is what helps our nations and societies establish justice and find security, spiritual well-being, and peace. And in our own divided nation over these past years, this is precisely what has led us to this danger to our democracy. There is no trust in the magistrates and officials and their deliberations. Everything is seen as a partisan affair. The courts are not considered reliable, the judges are not seen as honest, and there's a perception that justice cannot be served. From the insurrection on January 6th to the voting laws being enacted, if there is no perception of justice, how can there be well-being? How can there be peace? How can there be harmony between different peoples or parts of a people? And if there is a history lesson to those reparations that began 70 years ago between West Germany and Israel, is that the reparations did work. They did fulfill their intended purpose of restoring relationship. And Begin was wrong about what he said about the rise of another Nazi Germany. Although the ethical question of whether to give reparations in return for pardon, that can only be answered in the heavens. But German goods contributed 10 to 20% of GDP, of Israel's GDP, for over a decade, and that propped up Israel's growth at a very important time in its development. And I remember when I was growing up in Israel, all the taxis were Mercedes because they were given by the German government in the second round of reparations. And it did create goodwill. And in our modern day, present-day Germans are seen very favorably by present-day Israelis. So when that year concluded, when the reparations were finally voted on January 1952, there were thousands of protesters around the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Some were so angry they were throwing rocks at the building because their lawmakers were taking money for the crimes of the Nazis. And yet Begin, despite his fiery words, he accepted the democratic process. And in his earlier speech, although his speech had to be interrupted, the one I was mentioning earlier, because procedurally the Knesset believed that he had insulted the Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and had to consult on what to do about it, he was allowed to conclude and make his inflammatory accusations. And he did so by acknowledging that they were both working, even though they deeply disagreed, for the common good of the Jewish people. And although at the helm of a minority party then, he eventually ascended himself to become prime minister and eventually a peacemaker. And next year will be 20 years since his death. The pursuit of justice is a very complex affair, but it's clear that a nation cannot find its security, its peace, and well-being until its officers and magistrates are, despite their differences, even heated differences, thought to be reliable, honest, and fair by the majority. And it's the faith of the collective in the justice that paves the way for peace. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the Universe, at this time of enduring division and distrust, help us find a common faith and trust in reliable and honest leaders and judges, so that we too can find a new period of harmony and peace. Shabbat Shalom. We turn to our Chetzi Kaddish